There's a subject that the early Chasidic movement stressed a lot. And they stressed it because they felt it was being ignored. And I think to a certain extent it is still ignored. I have a test for this, which you can adopt if you use it on a person who's not going to be offended. There's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which I quote to people as saying, Halomei Torah zochel ledvarim harbe. Person who learns Torah merits a great many benefits. And then the Mishnah goes on to list a whole long slew of benefits that the person gets from studying Torah. So I introduce the subject that way, and usually the people that are saying, yeah, we know that, we're familiar with that. And then I say to them, actually I quoted it wrong. What mistake did I make in quoting it? And usually, they don't pick out a mistake on the basis of their memories. The Mishnah doesn't say what I said. I left out a word. It says, Halomei Torah Lishmah Zocher Ledvarim Harbe. Oh ho, right. They didn't even notice that it's missing. And I paused for the recording. Those of you who are watching this recording, did you get it? Did it occur to you? I left out the word Lishmah. Learning Torah Lishmah is very important. Now you'll say, well, isn't Lishmah important for all mitzvahs? Yeah, it is. That's no question about it. But it's also very important for learning. And the Gemara, several places, discusses what it means to learn Lishmah, Shalol Lishmah, whether that's just inferior learning or whether it is a crime, which one should avoid. Tosfos reconciles different passages on that score. What I want to know is what I've asked people who are in a certain branch of Haredi Judaism. Do you know what Lishmah means? Did you ever hear a discussion of Lishmah? You spent years in a yeshiva. The yeshiva has a mashgiach. The mashgiach is supposed to give lectures on what it means to serve God, and how to serve God, and what you should be doing. And as far as learning Torah is concerned, you definitely have heard lectures on don't waste time and learn Torah even in the times when the vacation times and so on and so on, and how important Torah is. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. I'm sure you heard Torah lectures on that. Mm-hmm. What about Lishmah? Most people tell me they never thought of it. They never heard a single discussion of it, not a single lecture on it. So, well, the early Hasidic movement thought it was very important. And they thought so for a number of different reasons, I think. First of all, in certain circles, the learning of Torah is a hyper-intellectual activity. The way it's learned is a tremendous challenge to the intellect, and there's tremendous credit given to people who use their intellect to come up with intellectually brilliant explanations and analyses. And if you are intellectual, it's very, very easy to be doing this as an intellectual exercise, which is self-satisfying because you take pride in intellectual achievements and earns you a lot of credit when you're surrounded by people who are competing intellectually. It's very easy to lose sight of it being a mitzvah altogether. So, you are not going to lose sight of the fact that tefillin is a mitzvah. The only reason you will put on leather boxes with leather straps and wear them for a half hour is because it's a mitzvah. Otherwise, you wouldn't be caught dead doing it. But when I made my first trip to South Africa 41 years ago, I was told about a certain group of people who were not current at that time, but there had been in Johannesburg. They got together once a week to study Talmud, and they came from all over the city to do this once a week to study Talmud together. On Saturday afternoon, from all over the city, they didn't walk. They were not practicing mitzvahs at all, but their background in Europe gave them a tremendous taste for the intricacies of Talmud. So they came together once a week to learn Talmud together. They drove, so what? That had nothing to do with it. They just came to learn Talmud. Because it was interesting, because it was challenging, because it was clever, because it was fun. Now, this shows you how a person who does keep mitzvahs and does believe could be sucked into a kind of Talmudic learning where the mitzvah plays no role, a very little role. You tell such a person, we spoke about this before, tell such a person, do you know that your ultimate intellectual grasp doesn't add to the mitzvah at all? Doesn't add to the mitzvah at all. Because we spoke last time about Rahman Boy, and I told you, the Derech Hashem, which is not written by someone who's in the Chasidic movement. For these people, if you're part of the Chasidic movement, we don't take you seriously anyway. But you can't say it about the Ramchal. And he says, the schar that you get for the mitzvah Talmud Torah is only in the hishtadlus, in the effort. It's not an achievement at all. I told you the reason, because you don't produce the achievement. The achievement is a gift from God. Why should you get schar for that? For these people, that would be devastating. By great svara that I thought up, you spent an hour working hard to think it up. And he spent an hour working hard to understand a Rashi on a very low level. You won't get any more schar than he will. You didn't do any more than he did. You spent an hour working hard. So he spent an hour working hard. That would be very crushing to his ego. And then, why do you think of your brilliant analysis as something valuable? Valuable for what? For your ego? For your standing in the crowd? Okay, that's value, all right. It's not Jewish value. It's not Torah value. This is why part of the reason why the Hasidic movement stressed the idea of learning the Lishmah. Let's put it in sociological terms. Anybody can learn the Shema. Anybody on any level. There were shuls in the big towns in Europe where they were divided by profession. There's the shoemaker's shul. What did they do? They learned Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is the stories of the Talmud. And sometimes they couldn't read them. They had to have someone read them and translate them for them and teach them what the content was, what the morals were. I spent an hour learning Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and they're learning Ein Yaakov. They could sit right next to you in Olam Haba. If they came there because they said, my Creator wants me to do this, and I had to spend an hour here in shul thinking about these things, learning these things, rather than lounging or drinking tea or schmoozing and so forth and so on, they'll get the same reward you'll get for learning Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So this is the kind of overall idea of Lishmah. Lishmah means as a mitzvah. I'm doing it because it's a mitzvah. And they can have a completely equal share in doing that. Now, I've asked people, practically, how do you express Lishmah? What should you do in your learning to make it Lishmah? My youngest son gave me two illustrations. One is, you're learning with your charusa, you're working on a tosfos, you don't get it. You don't get it. You go home with it. Yeah, but what could tosfos have made? You think about it, look at some svarim, and about 11:30, it hits you. Got it! Got it! I now know what the Tosfos means. Next morning, you go into your chavrusa, say, listen, that Tosfos, I've got it, listen, here's the pshat, right? How about, instead of saying that, saying, I was thinking about the Tosfos and I remembered that 3 years ago somebody told me pshat in this Tosfos. Somebody told me pshat, here it is, right? What's the difference? The difference is how much ego satisfaction and credit you get for providing the answer. If you thought it up, boy, then you're great. And if somebody told you 3 years ago, it's nice that you had it and remembered it, that's nice, but it's not the same as thinking it up. Are you allowed to lie about something like this? Yes, you are allowed to lie. Yes, you are allowed to lie. To not take credit for your learning, you're allowed to make up a story so that you don't get credit for the learning. So that would be much more Lishmah. If you provided the terrorists in a way that didn't give you credit. Is another thing that would be an illustration of Lishmah. You're learning with your chavrusa, the Tosfos, and a beginner comes over and he says, could you help me understand this Rashi? Now, I don't know what the mores are today, but when I learned in yeshiva, a few years that I did, it was like an unwritten rule. If anybody needs help, you can ask anybody else. And you might be a beginner, you might walk over to the advanced students, but it didn't matter. You ask, you get an answer. Right? Now the question is, how do you feel when you're learning that juicy Tosfos, and he comes over and asks, how do I explain the words in the Rashi? It'll take you 20 minutes. How do you feel about those 20 minutes? Do you feel, I have to do this. I know I have to do this. But what a loss. My gosh. I'm losing 20 minutes of working on the Tosfos. Or do you say, to Ribono Shel Olam, I'm trying to do your mitzvahs. I'm trying to learn to fulfill your Torah. When I'm sitting here learning on the chavrusa, I'm fulfilling your Torah. And now you gave me an opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah in another way. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the Tosfos and my good chavrusa, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to explain it to a beginner. Then it would be much more Lishmah. I'm doing what the Eibishter wants because he wants me to do it, rather than my own intellectual satisfaction and credit and standing in the group. Those are two ways to make it into Lishmah that my son told me. Then, if you look at the tefillos that we have and analyze them in this respect, I think you can get a lot of guidance. We spoke about this once, the relationship between Torah and study of Torah and performance. I told you that in all the weekday prayers, it's Torah and mitzvahs. Always Torah first and mitzvah second. And that's the way it is in the mouth of the Am. People always talk about Torah mitzvahs. But I don't think you ever hear someone talk about mitzvahs and Torah. It would be very unnatural. But once, 3 times during the week, you actually do put mitzvahs first and Torah second. I'm telling you this, in the few seconds it takes me to get to the answer, think to yourself, especially you who are looking at this recording, yeah? Where did I put mitzvahs first and Torah second? It doesn't occur to you, it doesn't jump to your tongue, then maybe it's because the idea is so out of sync with what you are naturally thinking that you don't get it. Shabbos, in the Shemona Esrei of Ma'ariv Shachos and Mincha, you say, Kadshenu b'mitzvosecha, v'seincho kenu b'sorasecha. Sanctify us with your commandments, and then give us our portion in Torah, in your Torah. Mitzvahs come first, and Torah comes second. Knowledge of Torah, learning Torah, knowledge of Torah comes second. Our share in your Torah. That's not something else. That's how you look at what you're getting. Because when you're studying Torah, it's not an accident you're studying this with this person, and not someplace else studying something else. Because Baruch Hu is steering you, he's gerrymandering your life to get what he wants you to have. So is that the way you learn it on Wednesday afternoon? This is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he's giving me what's good for my neshama. That's why I'm learning this. And if the attitude is about the learning, was my learning today successful? Did I have a good day learning? Does it ever occur to you to think, am I holier now than I was in the morning? Holier? Does that ever come up on the screen? What comes up on the screen is, did I think of good ideas? Did I pay attention? Did I not get distracted? Was I kind to my chavusa? Am I holier now? So you say, well, you did the mitzvah, right? So of course you're holier. It's obvious, you can just take it for granted. No, you cannot. No, you cannot. First of all, you could ask how much Lishmah was in it. And that could be a critique of the whole performance. Especially when you argue with your chavusa, how you argue with him, and how you feel about winning the argument or losing the argument. I know people who every time you correct them, they say, thank you. And they mean it. It's like you gave them money. You say, thank you. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for straightening me out. Because they did you a great favor. But if you think later, because Baruch was giving you an opportunity to raise your ruchnius, raise your neshama, and you should feel grateful for that. That could help also with the Lishmah. It could help with the idea of the. Now I want to push this much deeper. The Gemara in Bracha says that there are Yisurim Shel Ahava. Yisurim Shel Ahava means suffering that God brings to a person out of love. There's a lot of discussion of what that means. Rashi says that you have pain in order to justify giving you more pleasure in the world to come. That's what he says. Maybe in order to understand what he means, you have to add some content to it, but those are the words he says. The Rambam rejects such an idea, we didn't know Rashi, but rejects such an idea with both hands, says absolutely unjust. Why should you have to pay for pleasure in the world to come by suffering here? What's one thing got to do with the other? As I think as the Ran says, Lama shelo yochal b'shtei shulchanos. Why should he eat at both tables? The Ramban also agrees that that's untenable, unthinkable. So if that's true, then what are the Yisurim Shel Ahava? So the Rambam and the Ramban have different explanations of it. That's not what I want to go into. What I want to go into is this. How can you tell whether the suffering that you're undergoing is some of these Yisurim Shel Ahava versus Yisurim that have another purpose? Yisurim have lots of different purposes. How can you tell? The Gemara gives two criteria. If the suffering interferes with your ability to study Torah, then it's not Yisurim Shel Ahava. Whatever the function of these sufferings that God brings on a person out of love, whatever the function is, it's not so important that it should disturb your ability to learn Torah. And the other one says it shouldn't disturb your ability to pray, to daven. Okay, when I first learned that, I thought to myself, boy, oh boy, that's going from one extreme to another. Learning Torah, Talmud Torah can get kulam. And it's the key to doing mitzvahs. And it's absolutely essential. And prayer, according to everyone except the Rabbi, the whole institution of prayer is only rabbinic. Except when there's danger, and you're praying for salvation, but otherwise, 3 times a day, the whole thing's rabbinic. Rambam says that once a day is deraisa, but he's in a tiny minority to say that. How can you compare the two of them? Yes, if Yisurim stopped my ability to learn Torah, I hear very well. That's a drastic effect. Stop tefillah? I would vote for Yisurim that forced me to be Mechal Shabbos, or to eat trade food, which is Matam Misalev. It distorts a person's spirituality. But why is prayer so important? I think the answer is this. Prayer and Talmud Torah are two halves of a dialogue. In Talmud Torah, we're talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in prayer, we are talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in Talmud Torah, he's talking to us. And what the Gemara is telling us is, Yisroel Shel Ava won't interfere with the communication between God and the person. That it won't do. If the suffering interferes with the communication, that's not the suffering that's brought out of love. For whatever purpose it has, it's not going to do it. It's not going to disturb that. I think with this analysis, you can explain something else in the Gemara. The Gemara says that some people, who spent all of his time learning, didn't daven. He did the other mitzvot, but he didn't daven. Why is davening different? Because when he's talking, don't interrupt. What he has to say to you is more important than what you have to say to him. If you're in a route, a station where he's talking continuously, just listen. Otherwise, Talmud Torah can't compete with any other mitzvah. This is extremely important. Now, this is a little bit of a footnote, but it's important to know. With all the praise and all the greatness of Talmud Torah gives way to any and every other mitzvah. Why? Because if you don't learn Torah in order to perform the mitzvahs, your learning is worthless. It's not only to perform. Learning the Torah is a mitzvah of its own, but if you're learning without the definite commitment to do the mitzvahs, then the learning becomes worthless. Even a rabbinic mitzvah makes absolutely no difference. So, this problem now, I get lost in the trail. So the Talmud Torah, right, has to be done in order to perform. Otherwise, it's worthless. So, so then why is prayer the exception? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has to do all the mitzvos, even though he spends every spare minute learning Torah. He has to do all the mitzvos, but not prayer. So if it's two halves of a dialogue, you can understand that. So then, that means that you have to experience the study of Torah as a communication from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're not just learning laws or learning values or learning facts. This is an interaction with the giver of the Torah. If you have that in mind, and I'm not now taking sides on whether you should have it consciously in mind and should fill half of your experience and thereby detract from the attention that you can give on understanding the complicated words you're trying to understand. That the Nefesh HaChaim talks about that. And I say about their points about. I told you about that. You can do it at the beginning, at the end, maybe once in the middle. Which is about Nefesh HaChaim even also agrees to. But it has to be experienced that way. Otherwise, the Lishmah is very weak. It's this interaction and dialogue that's going on. Now we spoke about something else, which could take this even a step further. We talked about the idea that we talked about where the will to do a mitzvah comes from, and we talked about the fact that there's a big difference between I've decided on my own that I am going to do this mitzvah versus I really wasn't planning on it, and somebody says to me, this is an important mitzvah and it would be wonderful if you would do it, and wonderful for you also. And he convinces me that I should do it, which means that the will to do the mitzvah came from him, and I picked it up from him. It wasn't mine. That gives him a much bigger share in what I'm doing. Even if in the first case he provided me with the means to do the mitzvah, but in the second case he provides me with the will to do the mitzvah. We spoke about this vis-a-vis if A tells B to worship an idol, bow down in front of an idol, and the word worship is prejudicial, bow down in front of an idol, and B says, I'm not doing it. And A says, if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you. And B says, okay, not going to die. Just, you ought to die. The halacha is that you should die rather than bow down to the idol. But I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. And he bows down to the idol because the will for the idol worship came from the other person. This one who bows down doesn't pay any penalty. He's threatened with death, and the will came from somebody else. We spoke about this in the Rambam. So where the will comes from is very important in determining what the identity of the action is. If I do something because of somebody else's will, he shares the essence of this action. In a certain sense, if he influences me to do it, he has a bigger share in the action than I do, which is Gottleib and ohr. Now, that means that my performance is acting out his will. So, we spoke about the idea of that vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that when you act to do a mitzvah, your performance is acting out God's will. That means that God's will, in a certain sense, inhabits you. The technical term in certain svarim is you become a lavush. You become like a garment that's being worn by God's will, and really it's God's will that's moving the garment. Just like when you have your hands in a glove, someone sees the glove moving, he understands it's the hand that's making the glove move. Here it's the Kodesh Baruch Hu's will that's making you. Yes, you submitted to it. You absorbed it, but once you absorbed it, that's what's making you move. And that's maybe the most exquisite connection between God and man that's possible. There's you become, in a certain sense, two parts of an integrated whole. By the way, there's a phrase that appears in Sfarim very, very often, and I've encountered people who misunderstand it. They say, X and Y will become one. Sometimes, in English, that could mean X will become equal to Y, identical with Y. It doesn't have to mean that. It can mean that X and Y will attach and interact in such a way that they become parts of a single whole. Not that they become identical. If you have a battery-powered machine which has no batteries in it, so the machine is dead, not going to do anything. On the other hand, the batteries on the shelf are certainly not going to do anything. You put the batteries into the machine, they become one. Batteries plus machine become one. What do they become? One functioning machine. That battery doesn't become machine doesn't become battery. So becoming one doesn't mean becoming identical. This is the key for understanding marriage, so becoming one. The man is a man, the woman is a woman, they remain male and female, but they integrate into a single thing of which they are parts. In a certain sense, you have that integration with the creator of the universe when you incorporate his will into you and act on it. Okay, now what are you doing when you're studying Torah? Well, two things are happening, but the one that I'm talking about at the moment is you're learning how to incorporate his will into you and become one with God. That's what you're learning. Well, that's pretty valuable. That's pretty important. And it's pretty important for you to know that that's what you're doing. It's also true that in the act of learning itself, if it's done as a mitzvah, in that very act, you're incorporating God's will into you, because you now, among other things, you know what to do. You're doing a mitzvah right now, but knowing what to do, like we said yesterday in the name of Rabbi Yonah, right? Committing yourself to do gets you credit for doing. You've already incorporated. What I'm talking now is about the spirituality of learning. This is what the Chasidic movement stressed, to see things in spiritual terms. because those are the real terms. Those are the terms of the reality that we're dealing with. And if you don't appreciate, in ancient times, certain places, I think this was in Egypt, maybe even in Greece, what was the function of the brain? The brain was a radiator. All those convolutions mean that the brain has a lot of surface energy. A lot of surface area. And that means that it can radiate heat and rid the body of excess heat. Thought was in the heart. Nothing to do with your head. That was in the brain, right? You say, man, they really got it wrong. They really got it wrong, right? Okay. Did they have interpersonal relationships? Sure they did. Their picture of how a person works was a drastically wrong picture. Yeah, it was a drastically wrong picture. But it didn't stop them from having interpersonal relationships. So you're incorporating into you this picture of how God wants you to behave. The incorporation can work even though what's ultimately behind it, what's ultimately driving it, the nature of the Creator himself, or what the ultimate consequences are and impact that doing it will have. You don't need that. You don't need to know that. All you need to know is, this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to study, and by studying it, he wants me to incorporate it into my identity, and when the occasion arises, he wants me to act on it, and then you become a levush, you become just like the glove on the hand for the reality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is presenting you with. That's where the spirituality really lies. And that's the idea of spirituality in general. Again, even if you don't know the details of how the spirituality works, it's really there. So one other idea about studying Torah, 1 second. Yeah, what should you study? Now, there are a few guidelines. One which hit me very early and became sort of a daunting challenge. When you get to the world to come, there is study of Torah there, whatever that means. And the principle was, any sefer that you ever learned anything from in your lifetime, you have a relationship to that sefer. In the world to come, it'll be one of the Sfarim that will be open to you. But something which you never opened, you won't have any connection to. So I thought, wow, okay, so let's, diversify a little bit. So there's the Yerushalmi. For a period of time, I learned the Daf Yomi. I've been learning Daf Yomi for more than 40 years. There was a period of time I would learn the Yerushalmi Masechta side by side with the Bavli Masechta. Did that for a number of different Masechtas. So I said, okay. I didn't go through the Yerushalmi as many times, but I learned something of it. You're young. You should think, however, over a lifetime of at least diversifying to the extent that you put your toes in each pool of Torah water, at least for some, a few months, just to get a sense of what's there. Especially, eventually, Nistar, Kabbalistic studies. It is possible. It is possible. You can get wonderful Sfarim. As a sefer, I don't think it's translated into English. It's called Usvartim Lechem. But Daniel Frisch composed a translation and commentary on Zohar and other Kabbalistic works, which has become phenomenally successful. It's called Mosok Midvash, Sweeter Than Honey. There were others before him, but none had the effect that his translation has had. One of my sons-in-law introduced me to it, and he knew that, and Daniel Frisch personally. It was a Yerushalmi. He died maybe 15 years ago. He did it on computer, And he was tremendous. He wrote a sefer called Usfartam Lachem. This is a sefer about Sfiras HaOmer, where you have 49 days that you count. For each day, he gives some ideas about what you should think about, what you should work on that day. He's taking this program from a much larger sefer, which I think is out of print, called Michas HaOmer. And he says so. But the first 15 pages of that sefer are an introduction to basic Talmudic concepts, basic Kabbalistic concepts. He writes in extremely clear Hebrew. He was a master, absolute master. So if you wanted a very short, well-organized, clear introduction to basic concepts of Nistar, that would be a wonderful place to start. If your Hebrew isn't up to it, you could easily find someone whose Hebrew is up to it, because again, it's not very difficult Hebrew. Just to give you an idea of who the author was, he had some illness, and he went to medical doctors, and they gave up on him. They couldn't help him. And he heard that in the Far East, there's some kind of guru who was able to handle various things, among which was the problem that he had. So he decided to go. So he went. And when it was his turn, the guru started doing whatever he was doing, and he said, no. Clear your mind. Your mind has to be clear. So he tried again, and it didn't work. He said, I told you to clear your mind. Well, Daniel first was thinking, Hashem Echad, God is one. Hashem is Echad. So he said, you mean that thought? And the guru said, yeah, clear your mind to that thought. And first said, no. If what you have to do requires me to clear my mind of that thought, I'd rather not have it. I'd rather be sick. So, we're talking about a person who, put his whole life where these ideas are coming from. Which does, by the way, make it sound like this guru did have some power. He understood, the fellow himself understood that Frisch is thinking about something, and because he's thinking about that thing, it's not going to work. So this is a good place to get an introduction to those ideas. And there are other places as well. I would not trust many of the English translations. Many English translations just are full of mistakes. And even if they aren't out mistakes, but they use English words to explain these concepts, and they cause false associations in a person's mind. I'll give you one example, and you can use this as a test. Someone's going to talk to you about Kabbalah. You can ask him. The very first move, or maybe second move in the whole development of everything that exists, it was called Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means contraction. Something becomes smaller. And the way it's described is that before that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, fills everything, and therefore there's no room for anything to exist other than God, so to speak. So, the first move has to be, make room. And the way he does that is, he makes room by contracting himself, so to speak, and then there's room for something else to exist. So the words that are used in the real Sfarim are tzimtzum, leaving behind a halal. And they translate a halal as an empty space. It's got to be empty because otherwise there's no room for the other thing to exist, right? Okay, that's dead wrong. That's dead wrong. Nothing is ever empty. Nothing. No empty spaces. Talking about tzimtzum, it means that whatever was there before contracts, so that the space is empty of what was there before. That's what it's empty of. But not empty, it's just empty of that. And it's filled with something called a reshimu, which means a remainder. Every time light abandons a place, it leaves behind a residue. That's a rule about light. So this is the ohr.edu, the infinite light, whatever that means. If it contracts, it leaves behind a space that's empty of ohr self. It's not empty, it's filled. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if it's filled, well, how did you accomplish anything? The point was to have empty space where there's room for something to exist. And if it's full, you don't have room for something to exist. And the answer is, we're not talking about space. We're not talking about room, 6 feet by 6 feet. Absolutely not. The physical terms that are being used are terms which have only spiritual connotation. And it requires a whole long investigation, elaboration, but you can test whether what you read or whether the person you're talking to thinks that it's contraction to leave behind an empty space where tables and chairs could be. If that's what he thinks, he hasn't gotten to first base. He hasn't gotten to first base, and you should definitely not follow up on that. Yeah.
Why is that such an essential barometer? Why is that the litmus test?
Why is what?
What is so? What kind of sift? Why does that particular piece sift people so well?
Oh, because it's, in my experience, it's a very, very common mistake for these people who have read it in English, and and because it's really the very beginning. So that's, after that things become complicated and subtle, and they themselves find hard to follow the details, and it's intuitive. God fills everything. There has to be room for something else. The words ring out an idea or very quickly and very simply. It's just the idea is dead wrong. One other one, which we have talked about, leisasar panui minei. The words literally mean there's no place empty of him. Okay, no place empty of him. That means he fills everything. He is everywhere. There's a child's song. God is here, God is there, God is everywhere, and so on. Yeah? Well, that song's good for 6-year-olds, but when you're 16, you ought to outgrow it. Only physical objects can be in physical places. Something that isn't a physical object can't be in a physical place. Physical location is a quality that physical objects have. If you are convinced, as you ought to be, that the creator of the universe is not a physical object, then the creator of the universe cannot be in your table or in your living room or in the stars or in anything. You say, yeah, but the Zohar says, no place is empty of him, as I have told you. That's no different from talking about God's eyes and God's ears and God's shoulders and God's legs, God's mouth and God's nose. Here too, you're using words which are physical words, but they mean to convey a spiritual reality. And in this case, I told you, the spiritual reality is that God's will gives existence to everything. So, to put it in still somewhat poetic terms, but much more accurately, you could say nothing can be totally disconnected from God. Nothing could have no relationship to God, because if it did, it wouldn't exist. It exists only because God's will is giving it existence. That's true. Not that God's in the table, yeah.
So, obviously I haven't read the deeper Kabbalistic literature. Does it make frequent use of metaphor and paradox, or is it mostly systematic and philosophical?
It makes use of metaphor a lot. Paradox, not so much. Paradox is really relative to your amount of knowledge. Sometimes a paradoxical impression is only because you have no clue of what's really going on. If I tell you that the table is almost all empty space, and your hand is almost all empty space, why did your hand go through the table? If I tell you, well, the hand and the table are really made out of very, very powerful magnets, and banging your hand on the table is something like trying to put two north poles of a magnet together. And as you know, when they get closer and closer, they skid away because they don't want to be sitting together. All of a sudden you say, okay, and if the magnet is distant, still, when you take the two powerful magnets and there's this much distance between the two north poles, it's still hard to push them together, because magnetic force doesn't require actual contact. Here you have atoms and particles, all of which most of which have magnetic properties, and the magnetic lattice it resists penetration, even though there's empty space there.
I guess one thing, so like Lahavdil, other religions, often in their sacred literature, they will, when they try to talk about sacred topics, they'll construct sentences that are intentionally designed to maybe have syntactic like peculiarities or like logical paradoxes, which are designed to unlink your dependence on the linguistic concept and point you to the reality itself. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I sort of, but I'm very skeptical about these things. What external evidence do you have that you're being pointed to a reality rather than just a fantasy? What external evidence do you have that you and 6 other people who are reading the same sentences are being pointed in the same direction? If it's beyond words to express, and there's nothing external to test it with, then what makes you think that it's a reality at all? It's true, we do have some cases where the words are paradoxical. We do have words like that. But I think they play a very special function. What the words do is they tell you it's describing something which in your present condition you can't understand. So you don't pretend to understand them. You say, here I'm being told, like for example, they saw the voices, they saw the sounds at Sinai, right? And there's no such thing as seeing sounds for us. Our words don't work that way. Don't talk about synesthesia. Synesthesia, you see red when you hear a trumpet, but you see a color and you hear a trumpet. You don't see the trumpet sound. So that's very valuable to know. Something happened there which, in my present state of understanding and experience, is totally divorced from my life. Well, it's important to know it's totally divorced. It's something which is, beyond understanding. The way if you were taught modern science to someone 200 years ago, he would also say, "Wow, come on, what are you talking about?" Right? That doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. It means it's something which I don't have the ability to understand. That's worth knowing. But that I don't say it points me in the direction of another reality which I come in contact with by the words. What I say is the words are designed to show me that I'm out of touch. There's something that I'm not in touch with. I'm not getting to it that way. So I think that's more. We do have, according to some, certain contradictions, and then we say, okay, we don't understand. But not this idea that you're being pointed in the direction of another reality. I think I would be quite suspicious about that. A great deal, we spoke about this also, a great deal of human understanding is something which you can't put into words. But then there's a verification that it's understanding. Like understanding someone else's psychological condition. You say, how do you know? What's your evidence? Give me the pieces of evidence that you use to draw a conclusion. Answer, I look at him and I know. Proof? If he really has this condition, then he needs this and this kind of therapy. And when I look and say he has a condition and I practice the therapy, almost always he's cured. Then I know I'm right. I'm right because I have external evidence that my intuition is based on reality. So that's fine. You don't have to be able to explain in words what you know, but you have to have some reason to think that it's real other than just a fantasy, and also to think that you and somebody else have something in common when you undergo the experience. Okay.